He told me to get out of my own kitchen. Not with a shout, not with anger in his voice even. He said it the way you tell someone to move their car out of your driveway. Flat, certain, like the answer to a question nobody had asked. I was standing at the counter making my morning coffee, the same counter I had stood at for 23 years. The same coffee maker my late husband Russell had given me for our anniversary, the one with the small crack on the handle that I always turned toward the wall. I had the radio on low, just enough to catch the weather before I started my day. My daughter-in-law walked in first. She opened the refrigerator without saying good morning, which I had gotten used to by then. Then my son came in behind her, and he poured himself a glass of orange juice, and then her husband, my son-in-law, I should clarify, because the story matters here, walked in last, still in the clothes he'd slept in, and looked at me like I was standing in the wrong place in a store. "We're going to need the kitchen for a while," he said. "Can you just—" He made a small gesture with his hand, like shooing something away. I looked at him. "This is my kitchen," I said. He smiled. Not a real smile. The kind that men use when they think they're being patient with someone who doesn't understand. "Loretta, come on," he said. My name from his mouth always sounded like a sigh. "We're trying to have a family breakfast. Can you just give us some space?" My son was looking at his orange juice. I turned off the coffee maker, picked up my mug, and walked to my bedroom. I sat in the chair by the window, the one I had reupholstered myself years ago in a blue fabric that had faded now to something closer to gray. I drank my coffee. It wasn't even fully brewed. That was the morning I understood that something had to change. Let me go back a little, because this didn't start the day they moved in. It started slow, the way these things always do. My son. I'll call him by what he is to me in this story, not his name, because this is not about embarrassing him. It's about what happened to me in my own home. He called me in February of 2022. He said he and his wife were having a hard time. The rent on their apartment had gone up. He just changed jobs and the new position wouldn't start paying well for another few months. Could they stay with me? Just until they got back on their feet? 3 months? Maybe 4. I said yes. Of course I said yes. He's my son. He was born in the back bedroom of this very house because the snow was too bad to drive to the hospital. I wasn't going to say no. My daughter-in-law. I had always tried to love her. I want to be clear about that. She came from a family very different from mine. Her mother had never worked outside the home, and her father made all the decisions, and somewhere in that upbringing, she had married a man with her father's temperament and her mother's expectations. That combination made her difficult to live with. But she was my son's wife, and so she was family, and when they came in March with their boxes and their habits, and the way they rearranged my living room furniture without asking, I told myself to be patient. 3 months became 6. 6 became a year. The job paid better now, they said, but the housing market was terrible. You couldn't find anything decent for what they could afford. I understood that. I lived through the housing crisis of 2008 in this same house, holding on with both hands. I understood financial pressure. What I didn't understand, or maybe what I refused to understand for too long, was that they had stopped looking. I found this out in stages. First, it was a conversation I overheard about how they were thinking about waiting until after the holidays. Then it was a mention that they were saving to make a down payment eventually. Then one evening, my son said, almost casually, that they'd decided it made more sense financially to stay put for now and save aggressively over the next year or two. I was 71 years old. I had raised my children in this house. I had buried my husband from this house 6 years before. I had made this place mine in every small way that a person does over decades. The magnolia I planted in the backyard the year my daughter was born. The pantry shelf I labeled in my own handwriting. The particular way the second burner on the stove runs a little hot and you have to remember to adjust. This was my home, and without ever sitting me down and asking, they had decided it was theirs now too, indefinitely. His name was Derek. I'll give him that much, because he is not a nameless thing in this story. He was 44 years old, and he worked in logistics, and he had an opinion about everything and a contribution to very little. He never paid rent. This was agreed upon at the beginning. They were saving up, but there was no end date attached to that agreement, and I had not been firm enough to require one. He never paid a utility bill, never offered grocery money, never once, in nearly 2 years, asked if there was something he could do to help around the house. He watched television in my living room with the volume louder than I keep it. He had his friends over without mentioning it beforehand. He cooked meals that left the stove a disaster and never fully cleaned it up. And my son watched all of this and said nothing. That's the part that hurt most. Not Derek, because Derek was what he always had been from the moment I met him. But my son was someone I had known his whole life. I had sat with him through fevers and nightmares and the particular heartbreak of being 17. He knew me. He knew this house, and he had chosen to look at his orange juice. I want to be honest with you, because I think honesty is the only thing that makes a story worth telling. I let it go on too long. I told myself I was being gracious. I told myself it was temporary. I told myself that pushing back would damage my relationship with my son, and I couldn't bear that. All of those things were partially true. But the fuller truth is that I was afraid of the conflict, afraid of what it would cost me, afraid of being the difficult one, the demanding one, the mother-in-law who made everything hard. We teach people how to treat us. I have heard that said many times, and I always agreed with it in theory. It took standing in my own bedroom at 8 in the morning with a half-brewed cup of coffee to understand it in practice. I didn't do anything that day. I sat in my blue chair, and I drank my coffee, and I listened to the sounds of their breakfast through the wall, and I thought about Russell, which I do when I need to think clearly. He was not a complicated man, but he was a fair one, and he had a way of cutting through to the center of a problem without drama. I could almost hear him. "Loretta, what exactly are you waiting for?" I didn't have a good answer. That evening, I called my friend Paulette. We have been friends since we taught together at Dalton Elementary in the 90s, and she is one of those rare people who will tell you the truth without cruelty. I told her what had happened in the kitchen. I told her about the 2 years. I told her about the orange juice and my son's eyes aimed at the floor. She was quiet for a moment. "Loretta," she said, "you know what you have to do." "I know," I said. "Have you called anyone yet?" "Not yet." "Call tomorrow," she said. First thing. I did not call a lawyer first, though that came later. I called my financial advisor because I needed to understand my own position clearly before I did anything else. I had the house, paid off, thank God, because Russell had been meticulous about that. I had my retirement accounts, my Social Security, a small pension from my years teaching. I was not wealthy, but I was stable. The house was mine, fully and legally. There was no ambiguity there. Then I called an attorney. A woman named, well, it doesn't matter what her name was. What matters is that she was clear and calm, and she explained to me that in the state of Georgia, even family members who have been living in your home can acquire certain informal expectations over time, and that the cleanest thing to do was to begin a formal process. Not hostile, not cruel, but formal. Written notice. A clear timeline. Documentation. "How long have they been there?" she asked. 22 months, I said. A brief pause. "Then we should move on this soon," she said. I asked her to draft the notice. She asked how much time I wanted to give them. I thought about it. I thought about my son and about the life I wanted and about the magnolia tree in the backyard that I had planted the year he was born. 60 days, I said. "That's generous. That's more than enough time." She agreed. She told me what would come next if they didn't comply, and I listened to every word. Then I thanked her and hung up and sat for a long time in the kitchen. My kitchen, in the quiet. The notice arrived on a Thursday. I was not home when it happened, which was intentional. Paulette and I had driven out to her sister's place in Covington, and we had a long lunch and walked around the property and talked about everything except what was happening back at my house. It was a beautiful afternoon, the kind Georgia does in October when the air finally loses that weight it carries all summer. I got a phone call at 2:15 in the afternoon. It was my son. Mom, he said. What is this? His voice was strange, not angry exactly, more like genuinely confused, the way a person sounds when something happens that they truly did not see coming. It's a notice, I said. Your attorney should explain it to you, but essentially it's a formal document telling you that you have 60 days to make arrangements. Mom, you can't. You didn't even. Why didn't you just talk to us? I thought about that very carefully before I answered. I have been talking to you for 22 months, I said. I said I needed to know your timeline. I said I was concerned. I said I wasn't comfortable. I was very clear and very kind, and nothing changed. So now I'm being formal. Silence. Derek is furious, my son said finally. I imagine he is, I said. He's saying you blindsided him. He told me to leave my own kitchen, I said. I don't think Derek gets to be the one who's blindsided. More silence, and then, quietly, something shifted in my son's voice. I'm sorry, he said. About the kitchen. I should have said something. It was not everything I needed from him, but it was a start, and I held on to it. The 60 days were not easy. I want to be honest about that too, because if I told you it was clean and simple from that point forward, I would be lying to you. Jarek made the weeks uncomfortable in every way a person can without crossing a clear line. He stopped speaking to me. He made his unhappiness known through silences and the sound of cabinet doors, and the particular way he'd move through a room when I was in it. He had 2 long conversations on the phone in the living room that I suspect were intended for me to overhear. Talking to someone, I don't know who, about how he was being kicked out of his home, how his mother-in-law had gone behind everyone's backs, how they had no idea where they were going to go. I live in a 4-bedroom house. I went about my life. My son was different after the phone call. Quieter, more careful. He started making his own coffee in the mornings and leaving the kitchen before I came in. One afternoon, I found him in the backyard standing near the magnolia, and I went out and stood next to him, and neither of us said anything for a few minutes. I remember when you planted this, he said. The year you were born, I said. Your father dug the hole. He nodded. We stood there a little longer. I don't want to lose you over this, Mom, he said. You're not losing me, I said. You're just having to grow up a little. He laughed, just slightly. It was the most honest moment we had had in years. My daughter-in-law came to me toward the end of the 2nd month. I was surprised by this. I had not expected her to come to me, and I had not expected what she said. She sat down at the kitchen table. She asked if she could sit, which she had never done before, and that told me something. And she looked at her hands for a moment before she spoke. I want you to know that I know this is your home, she said. I don't think I acted like it, and I think I let him. She stopped, started again. I should have handled things differently. I looked at her. In 22 months, I had never seen her vulnerable, and I was not entirely sure how to respond to it. I appreciate you saying that, I said, and I meant it. She asked if there was any chance I would reconsider. I told her gently that the decision was made, but that I hoped we could come out of this with something intact. She nodded. She didn't cry, which I respected. We did not hug or make any promises, but something shifted in the room, and when she left, I sat there for a moment and felt something I hadn't expected to feel. A kind of sadness for her, separate from everything else. She had spent years managing a difficult man, and somewhere in the process had become someone harder than she needed to be. That wasn't entirely her fault. I did not forgive Derek, but I made space in my understanding for her. They left on a Saturday morning in December. I had offered to be gone while they moved out, and they took me up on it. Paulette came and picked me up at 8 in the morning, and we went to the farmer's market and then to breakfast at a place we like on Ponce de Leon, and we talked about our grandchildren and the book she was reading and the trip to Savannah we kept saying we were going to take. We came back to my house a little after noon. I stood in the doorway for a moment. The furniture was back to the way I had always kept it. I think my daughter-in-law had done that, or maybe my son. The kitchen was clean. There was a small envelope on the counter with my name on it in my son's handwriting. I opened it later, after Paulette had gone home. It was a card, the simple kind, nothing fancy. He had written inside, "Mom, I'm sorry it took so long. We'll do better. I love you." There was a gift card to my favorite nursery tucked inside. Enough to buy 2 new rose bushes for the front bed I'd been wanting to fill in. I set it on the windowsill and stood in my kitchen for a moment without doing anything at all. The refrigerator hummed, the little crack on the coffee maker handle turned toward the wall. The second burner that runs hot, mine. I want to tell you what I've learned, not as a lecture, but as a letter to anyone who might be standing where I was standing 2 years ago. Kindness without limits is not kindness. It's an invitation. When we allow people to take more than we've offered, we are not being generous. We are disappearing quietly, a little at a time, until one morning we find ourselves standing in our own kitchen being waved away like something inconvenient. I am not the same woman I was before that morning. I am clearer. I am firmer. I have relearned how to take up space in my own life, which sounds small and isn't. My son and I talk every Sunday now. We are finding our way back to each other, which takes time but is possible. My daughter-in-law sends a text occasionally, nothing much, but it means something. Derek I have not heard from and do not expect to. That is fine. Some people teach you about yourself by showing you who you cannot be. The magnolia is going to bloom again in the spring. It does, every year, without fail. I have watched it from this window for more than 30 years, and it has never once forgotten who it is or what it was planted here to do. Neither, it turns out, have I. There is a kind of quiet that belongs to you. Not empty quiet, not the quiet of someone who has given up. The quiet of a person in their own home, on their own terms, with their coffee exactly the way they like it. I found my way back to that quiet, and if you're listening to this and something in it sounds familiar, the half-brewed coffee, the averted eyes, the slow erosion of a space that was supposed to be yours, then I want you to know that you can find your way back to. You are not asking for too much by asking for what is already yours. You are allowed to come home. I have thought about this a lot since that December morning when I came home to a quiet house. Not everything that happened to me was done to me. That's the part I had to sit with the longest. Derek was difficult from the beginning. I knew that. He was the kind of man who expands to fill whatever space he's given, and I gave him too much space for too long. But I did that. I made that choice over and over. Every time I told myself to be patient, every time I swallowed a boundary I should have spoken out loud. The situation didn't appear overnight. It grew in the room I left open for it. That's not me being hard on myself. That's just how cause and effect works. When we are consistently soft in places that require us to be firm, we don't avoid conflict. We only delay it and let it grow larger in the meantime. I wanted peace so badly that I accidentally built the conditions for the opposite of peace. 22 months of quiet resentment in my own home, a half-brewed cup of coffee, and a son looking at his orange juice instead of at me. That was the cost of the conflict I kept avoiding. What I know now is that self-respect is not a feeling, it's a practice. It's something you do every day in small ways. The conversation you have early instead of waiting. The boundary you name clearly instead of hinting at. The moment you choose honesty with the people you love over the easier path of just getting through the week. I had let that practice slip, and when I finally picked it back up, it felt foreign at first, like a muscle I hadn't used in years. The attorney's phone call, the notice, the 60 days, none of that was dramatic, not really. It was just the practical shape that self-respect took at that particular moment. What required more courage than the phone call was the conversation with my son in the backyard, standing under the magnolia, telling him that he had let me down, not with anger, but with honesty. That was harder than any legal document. My friend Paulette told me once that the people who love us most are often the ones we are least honest with, because the stakes feel too high. I think she's right, and I think that's a quiet tragedy in a lot of families. The things that go unsaid between people who actually care about each other. because everyone is trying to protect something that only honesty can actually protect. My son and I are rebuilding. It's slow and it's real, and it's worth more to me than the version of the relationship we had before, which was comfortable on the surface and hollow underneath. He is learning things about himself that he needed to learn. I am learning things about myself too. Neither of us is the same as we were 2 years ago, and I think that is a good thing, even though the path to get here was painful. If I could say anything to the person listening to this who recognizes something in this story, the erasure, the slow disappearing, the coffee that gets colder while you wait for someone else to do the right thing, I would say this: the moment you act with clarity is the moment things can actually begin to change. Not the moment someone else changes, the moment you do. You cannot control what Derek does. You cannot make your son look up from his glass. What you can do, what you have always been able to do, is decide what you are willing to accept in the space that belongs to you. That decision is yours. It has always been yours. Come back to it.